Mr Chair.
David Bennett.
Clarification, sir.
Simply for clarification, point
Yes,
of order,
sir.
Materia Tudo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. So, just can I clarify then that you are not ruling out members of Parliament in this committee stage debate, describing the impacts as part of the analysis of the legislation we are considering. You are not ruling out us describing the impacts of this legislation on the constituents that we represent in this House.
The impacts of the legislation should be well described within the first, second and third reading. The purpose of this committee stage is to analyse and debate the strict terms of what each part does. So members do not have leniency to spend several minutes in a 5-minute call putting in context which has been done several times over the course of this, or they run the risk of being called for repetition and being sat down. So this is about analysis. The committee stage is about analysis of the parts that we're debating at any one time. I hope that's clear enough.
Mr Chair.
David Bennett. David Bennett.
I move that the question be now put.
Sue Moroney.
It's a pleasure to rise and speak to this excellent supplementary order paper from Materia Tudo about actually making sure that the money that is dedicated to the Housing Corporation or Housing New Zealand is used for the purpose of housing New Zealanders. It's not a hard thing to ask for. I know, pretty radical, but actually it's pretty simple in its context. It's what every New Zealander would expect its government to be doing on its behalf, ensuring that money put aside in the budget for housing is dedicated to housing. Mr Chair, I want to bring Hamilton into the debate because we've spoken a lot about Auckland, and I see that there are two members opposite in the chamber who are from Hamilton, but I don't think we're going to hear anything from them anytime soon because they're probably too embarrassed to talk about the impact that Part 7 has on their constituents in Hamilton, and so they should be. Because about 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker, Andrew Little came to Hamilton and he addressed a lunchtime meeting on the issue of housing, and there was standing room only, because that is how much this issue of the Housing Corporation and how it's operating in New Zealand and the lack of housing available under the Housing Corporation is impacting on Hamiltonians. And David Bennett might find it entertaining, but I can tell that member, and he should know this himself and the people who come in his door, that it is not at all entertaining for those people who are sleeping in cars, who are sleeping in garages, because the Housing Corporation's paying a profit, a surplus back to his government instead of building more state houses in Hamilton where they are needed. And the example I'll give you is that, I took Andrew Little to see this particular block of land, Jepson Place, in David Bennett's electorate. Actually, Jepson Place, Day Street, around that area, over in Hamilton East, beautifully located piece of housing New Zealand land, largely abandoned. State houses boarded up, left derelict by that government for years while the needs of housing grow exponentially in Hamilton. While our housing prices have increased an average of 30% in the last year alone, and that government has left that block of land empty, boarded up, derelict, like a ghetto in the middle of Hamilton.
So back to this part.
Back to this part, Mr Speaker, the surplus that the Housing Corporation is been told to pay back to that government should be spent on developing good, healthy state houses in Jepson Place, where people can live. Not these resource consents where people can't live in them, but actual houses built by Housing New Zealand. And I'll give another example in Hamilton. Another one in David Bennett's electorate, actually. Known locally as Poets' Corner. Well, actually nothing could be less poetic than what's happened to that Housing New Zealand land, that the corporation should be using that surplus to build on. And in fact, it was under the last Labor government where we decided that that particular development wasn't up to standard, and so we cleared it. And we had consulted with the local community to find out what type of state housing they wanted erected back in its place. And we had an agreement with the community, because we consulted with them, about exactly what that development would look like. What happened next was that when the incoming national government came in, they left that land abandoned and again derelict 4 years. 4 years. And still not one state housing tenant has a house back in Poets Corner. Still no one is actually tenanted back in that block of land because they still have not built state houses there. No, they haven't. Is anyone living there, David Bennett? Who's living there? What's the street address? You opened them last week. So it took them how many years? 9 years are we up to? Well, 8 years. 8 years, and they opened one house last week. I don't know if anyone's living in it yet, but that's how long that government has neglected state housing in places like Hamilton where the housing needs are that high, Mr Speaker. So Part 7 would ensure that instead of paying a dividend back to that greedy government to balance their books, that instead the Housing Corporation would be able to invest money building good, healthy state houses in cities like Hamilton.
I call Kamaljeet Singh Bakshi.